think, yes. The machines are talking to each other. Now let us talk to each other. So, right, this is the only time we meet this week. The opposite of last week for the other class. Okay, so next week, I should have brought your papers so that you can get them out physically, all 7 of you. But you can come by the office and get them. They'll be in a box. Those of you who turned your stuff in online, remind me if you haven't seen grades reflected for the other stuff that you've turned in. Still catching up. People still handing in midterms.
Were we supposed to take our midterms last week?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, the week before, actually. We're
Okay.
in week 9 now, so they were due back in week 8. So, but stuff happens. Random and anomalous events occur. People have lives. So, you getting signal or? Okay, all right, cool. All right, so last week we, the reason I'm really hip on this dimension of beings thing is because a lot of times people, their conception of who they are is probably the major block to moving on. And so, as an example, when you, if this is you, and I will take the drawing instructions to heart. This is you in your box, your conception of who you are, and basically you think of yourself as bounded by these, 6 different planes that conceptualize your reality. So, your body, your mind, your spirit, your soul, your family relationships, your job, et cetera, et cetera. If you could do that, and just think of 6 different ways that you interact with the world, and they have multiple dimensions that you don't necessarily see. So, I, personally, for example, I'm a drug counselor, but that has already evolved beyond what that used to be 30 years ago, because the field changed and people's needs changed. So a number of us talk about, okay, what has happened educationally in the schools is the schools were designed to teach students whose families were together enough to teach them the basics of how to operate in society, and gave them their identity and coping skills. And then they were basically then supposed to be ready for school, already showing up, knowing their ABCs and their times tables and how to play nice with others and share and all the stuff that, Robert Fulghum talks about is all I needed to know in life was in kindergarten, blah-de-blah-de-blah, right. Okay, but when certain other forces within society started unraveling the family, who's there to teach people that? So one of the things that we're looking at is, okay, what would relationship school look like? Because that's one of the things like we're dealing with, is people who are grieving something. Like, okay, you might take a grief workshop if you have the money, but most of the time you don't. So who teaches you how to do that? And you're not just grieving people dying, you're also grieving the loss of something, some part of your identity. How do you get it back? And so that you're functioning. Because a lot of times you basically are functioning in crisis, from crisis to crisis to crisis. So part of that is kind of like a limitation, like a cage. And people actually even describe their lives like that, like a cage, in terms of looking at addictive behavior. So what I was trying to do is say, all right, the answer to your question might be outside of the box that you already exist in. You're already out of the box just by being able to formulate the question. Now all you have to do is act as if you know the answer. Because some of your words are leading me to believe you know the answer. Well, what do you mean by that? Explain it to me in concrete terms. Okay, do this. Oh, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do anything spiritual. Okay, let's reframe it so that it's not spiritual. But it's the same thing. It's a series of actions. You're operating outside of the box. And explained in a bunch of different ways, and so what becomes the block is how you think you are in the world, as an example. So not just thinking, but also feeling and being. So in the dimensions of being piece, the idea is, okay, you think and feel, that's a baby. I'm dealing with a 2-year-old, and you can see this extending into 3, where they start getting really whiny and crying as a mode of getting what they want. And until you say, okay, use your words, or, well, now they've got the words, so don't ask in that tone of voice. We're willing to give you that. So think and feel. Think, feel, and do, child, without necessarily thinking about consequences. Think, feel, and do, reflect, and project the adolescent. This is the point at which the forebrain or angel brain is beginning to start operating, and so you can project into the future and connect present actions with future consequences. Unless, for example, you have been affected by what's called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, in which you may look, quote unquote, normal, but the actual brain connections that allow you to connect present and past with future consequences isn't there. So you just think, do, without consequences. You're impulsive, and you can be led. You can actually have that kind of thing, that think, do, without fetal alcohol syndrome, just by stunting your education or limiting limiting your outlook.
Excuse me?
Yes?
Oh, so I was always taught fetal alcohol syndrome, the person kind of looked like a spider monkey or something. Like there was
yes.
a physical thing.
That's why our thinking is that it's a spectrum. Okay? What we used to call full-blown FAS is basically you could actually have a deformity of the face where, like, if it's a white kid, they have epicanthic folds like they're Asian. This is what's called Down syndrome. Like, fetal alcohol syndrome was actually the largest cause, not largest cause, but the most preventable cause of what we used to call developmental retardation, because that's how it happened. So what Sir Robert Downes, I am repeating myself, but it was a different class. So, as Sir Robert Downes, British physician, was observing white people who were exposing their kids to alcohol, because the concept of addiction didn't exist in that part of the 19th century. Remember, from Candace Burt's book, we didn't even have a germ theory in Western medicine. We didn't connect in the United States. Fetal alcohol syndrome didn't even exist as a term until 1978, right? So in the 1800s, where they're just drinking, and they're drinking all through the pregnancy, producing these kids where they already had this racial conception that whites were superior, Caucasoid, then Mongoloid, okay, the next people who devolved from white people, then Negroid, right? So white racial superiority. So Down syndrome, when they were referring to Mongoloid idiots, they're not describing Asian kids. They're describing white kids with fetal alcohol syndrome. But they didn't have the language to say that, right? And they didn't have a concept of addiction then. right? So, nor do they have a concept of sanitation and hygiene. Okay, right, and these are the people that we learned from, or at least, this is why we're the English-speaking world, Again, that we learned our stuff from the British and we refined it in some ways and in some ways not so much. So the reason we call it a spectrum, and so fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that includes kids that we used to call FAE. That is, they wouldn't have the classic FAS face, okay? But the brain damage was hidden. They looked normal, but the brain was affected in terms of their development as well as having some glandular stuff, so they couldn't connect consequences because the connections weren't actually there. And we had to have MRI devices that could image the brain to actually see that, which, we didn't have until recently in all this, right? So that's why I can say, look, you're training to be a pro, this stuff changes and our understanding changes every 6 months. Really, literally. Now, just like that question in the midterm, okay? We've only proven genetic predisposition with alcohol, and the only way we can say that we've proved it is we've done the scientific work. Could that happen with other drugs? Hell yeah. But you can't study an illegal drug for longitudinal. You can't allow people to use something that, is harmful for them, that's illegal, right? That's an ethical problem. Like, okay, maybe we could get around that and you could volunteer, but how's that going to happen? Okay, all we can say with, for example, like cocaine, yeah, it makes monsters. Methamphetamine used during pregnancy makes monsters, definitely. Weed doesn't make monsters. What are the deficits? We need to study that. Because I know kids that, their mom smoked all through their pregnancy, and they're brilliant kids if short-tempered and impatient. Is that they're teenagers or what? Or two? Whatever. I don't know. Again, we need to study, right? So obviously many of the danger things that the anti-drug people talk about, which aren't really scientific or stretching the science, certainly we can't say there's no effect, but we can't also, on the other hand, emphasize the negative effects. So, so that's FAS, fetal alcohol spectrum. We used to also have a term back in the day, FADE, fetal alcohol and other drug effects, because rarely do people actually just use one drug. I mean, it happens, but people use multiple drugs. So, basically the physiology, usually we talk about this in the treatment class, but as civilians, you should know that because of how the blood interface between mom and baby works, they only share her liver. So basically, whatever mom does, baby does at least twice of. And it stays in longer because they only got one liver. That's part of why, the legal drinking age is 21, because your liver is fully developed by 21, unless you do things to impede it. Not that this is generally known, but so part of that. Those dimensions of being, think, feel, do, reflect, project, can be affected by your exposure to chemicals at which particular time. But, you can also begin to compensate for them with other skills. So think, feel, do, reflect, project, proact, act, react, which is an adult point of view where you basically have built some skills from be able to project the future so that you can also predict that things are going to happen and prepare for them. And then look at going beyond the adult level of reacting to responding in a way that is calm. So with crisis training, or basically being able to calm yourself and soothe yourself, if you're continually in a crisis, be able to respond from a thoughtful place without being carried away by the crisis emotional reaction around you. Say, okay, this is what needs to happen. And then resonate. Resound, literally, that doesn't necessarily mean sing or whistling in the dark, but it also means that you can, the only way I can say it, or a way I can say it in English, is that you can affect the atmosphere around you, the situation around you, by being calm and moving it towards the way that is optimal by practicing it yourself. So that's a level of practicing self-mastery. And then you can be a teacher. Once you've mastered self-mastery, you can teach others to master themselves. And at that level, you're being the change you want to see in the world, like Gandhi had talked about, among others. And Albert. So that's dimension 6, dimension 7 and beyond. Basically, they're game changers. So many names, and we basically know them by their classic names, like they found religions or whatever, perform what are miracles. But I would point out to you that they're simply applying higher science. Science is the collection of basically questions, being able to ask a question, formulate an answer, and have it be tested through repetition and practice. So, as an example, if all you know how to do, the only way you know how to make fire is rubbing sticks together, matches look like magic. And if the only way you know how to make fire is using matches, a lighter looks like magic. And if all you have is a lighter, basically electricity and electric range looks like magic. And a nuclear power plant, and so on, right? So there are higher laws of and higher dimensions of human beings and humanity. So you don't necessarily have to be a mystic to appreciate them or understand them. You don't even have to be an Einstein. But if I were to consult Einstein, so this is his answer to how do we face racism and anti-Semitism. This is his answer to a rabbi who asked on behalf of his daughter.